Welcome in from your SUV, from your tractor or your ute, or maybe you're even riding your electric motorbike. But from wherever you are, you're with Alistair Moorhead and Glenn Judson, and this is the Al and Juddy Show. Well, what we want to do is reach out and provide you some technical information on a range of agricultural topics which may interest you, but to do it in a different way. Casual and comfortable format that allows you to listen where you want and when you want. This is intended for general information, and for more specific advice, contact your local Agricom rep.
Here we are with Lara from marketing, and what have you got in the Q&As for us today, Lara?
What's up, team? We've got a question here. Generally speaking, what are the fundamentals of your favourite pasture mixes?
Oh, you go first, Alistair.
Fundamentals of my favourite pasture mix. I probably at heart it would be having a very, very good legume content. I'm very aware that legumes establish much, much better than most people acknowledge or realise. You have to remember back to the little cotyledons coming out of the ground right at the very start of the germination phase of a new pasture. And what you will always see is the clover is there at the start. What happens is the clover slows down and the grass speeds up. And next thing you have lots of shading. And one of the weaknesses I see with pastures not having great clover from the start is that we allow too much grass to form before we start grazing it. My favourite pastures are grass, white clover and red clover in our preferred grasses. And seeing them perform, particularly in the months of December through to February, it's just awesome to see really strong legume contents through the summer like that.
Yeah, I'm a little bit the same. I think I value legume. I really like red clover. And you know, there are some things about red clover that you know, in terms of they don't spread, but I really like my red clover. I also love seeing in pasture mixes herbs, and particularly ecotane. I'm a real fan of that. And then I think the issue for me is then you've got to find a grass that has the privilege of being with those two other species. So that's my ideal pasture mix.
Stunning. You both look like rock fiends. Who are we going here, Metallica or AC/DC?
AC/DC, all highway to L. It's the best day.
Yeah,
you see what I did there?
I see what you did there.
Excellent,
Juddy.
So good. Yeah. If you have any questions, technical, serious, lighthearted, or anything in between, please hit us up. There's an Al and Juddy Facebook page or our Agricom socials as well, or info@agricom.co.nz.
Oh, g'day there, Al. Looking well. Hey, have you ever done clay bird shooting blindfolded?
No, Juddy, I haven't.
You don't know what you're missing. Anyway, what are we going to talk about today?
Well, today, Juddy, we're going to discuss how to win a winter feed competition. And to help us through this process, we've got Fraser Harrison joining us in the studio today. And he's our forage system specialist. And between him and myself, we've been involved with a lot of winter feed competitions. And at heart, what the discussion really is about is preparing and growing good winter feed crops. And behind it is, you know, the whole local community concept of winter feed competitions.
Well, welcome, Fraser.
Thanks, Juddy and Al.
So, actually, to you, Alistair, just describe what for our listeners, what is a winter feed competition?
Oh, well, I think it's a pretty cool event started by a lot of different entities around New Zealand. Most of them are community-based, but we have an Agricultural and Pastoral Association in New Zealand, which is responsible for running a lot of our local fairs and shows. And as one aspect of these community agricultural groups is that they run a feed competition, often based in the late autumn, fall, and where communities will put forward their best crops, and then a panel will come around and judge them.
Okay, and so you've been a judge for a long time, actually. What's the process? So, tell me what happens on the day when you're judging those.
Oh, well, typically, depending on who's running it and what organisation is hosting it, what you get is you'll get a judge that might be an industry person, using myself or Fraser as an example, and the community the organising community will probably bring in a local farmer from another community outside their region, and they'll be the sort of impartial out of town judge, and that's always great. And it's actually a really good thing because that individual gets to see the whole district. He gets to see a lot of people's properties, and they get to take that experience back into their own group as well. And what we'd do is we'd have a group of retail people join us who are responsible for being agronomists for these crops. They'll join us. Often they would encourage some of their farmer clients to put in some of their better examples. And then we'd have a group of farmers often associated with the group and would join and possibly travel around. Just depends on exactly which organisation or community is running it to, exactly how many people join on the roadshow.
So as a judge, you're visiting these different crops, getting into the paddock.
Yep.
Are you and what sort of things are you looking for?
Oh, well, I've been running a system for a very, very long time where I try to relativize everything that I'm working off. So I work off a system that is associated with out of 100, basically a score out of 100. And what I do is I look at the style of crop that I've got, and I would identify the values that a farmer would value from this particular style of crop.
So just coming back a bit. So when you talk about crop, right, we're talking about, for example, a kale crop would be in that. What other categories?
Typically, this is the thing, is depending on the society, depending on the region, it could be anything from autumn sown, winter saved pasture.
Yep.
Autumn sown cereal.
Yep.
Cereal mixtures.
Yep.
Late summer sown brassicas for winter feed, or late spring, early summer brassicas for winter feed. And they could be fodder beet, kale, Swedes, and often the rapes are used from the summer sowing into autumn.
So clearly each of those crops have some different attributes.
Yep, different yield potentials, different holding ability, and different presentation, to be quite frank, at the end of autumn, end of fall, just hitting winter, just when they're starting to be utilised, or what their jobs in life are, is to be fed off during the cold months of the year.
So to be really clear, you don't have these categories where you have, all the grasses in one category and maybe all the brassicas in another.
Oh, you do.
But what you're doing is you're having an overall, or you are in categories.
You do, but you tend to have an overall winner. And so to have an overall winner, you have to have a system that actually reflects the value, and not always the economic value, but the value of creating almost like, dare I say it, the perfect crop on day of judging.
Yep. And
so I value the beautifully presented autumn saved pasture as much as I do the high yielding fodder beet crop. If the farmer is showing just wonderful best practice, intuition to set up and present, the maximum amount of yield with the maximum amount of quality in a state at the day of judging. You need to be able to reflect someone doing and delivering the best outcome, regardless of the volume.
Do you get any input from the farmer? Do you?
Absolutely. As I say, first things first, step back. How do you go about judging these things? Like I say, I put everything on a 100ized figure. And at the very start, we acknowledge the value of certain crops, being the yield or quality or other traits like the mixtures that you might use. And so I allocate points and values. So for example, for a high yielding crop like fodder beet, I value yield highly, because the quality is often extremely high.
Yep.
And therefore it gets more points for yield.
Yep.
And so that's how you sort of moderate the different things. Like for kale, I value not only yield, but I value the fact that can animals eat it? Is the quality high throughout the whole plant? What is the predicted utilization going to be like at the end? And so quality becomes a highly valued part of the 100ized score.
Right.
So yield is not everything. In fact, it's, probably only 50% of what you would judge on that. You turn to grass, and the reality is yield is not always everything, but quality is often everything, because if you're going to defer grass moving into winter, the the thing that you can't afford to have is a lot of dead material in your pasture at the start of winter, because if you get snow or frost, that could actually turn to mush and rot. So you've got a whole lot of things that you want to make relative for the individual crop, and then from there you are able to, at the end, judge them equally.
Yeah. So coming back to the question is, you're presented with a crop on the day. How much of it is what you see, and how much of it is what the farmer articulates to you in terms of how he's done that?
The articulation is not as great as what we see, because they've just taken us. They just take us to what, we can only judge what we see on the day. And that's why a major statement of a winter feed competition is on the day of judging. Yeah. Like if you get snow tomorrow, there's a very big chance that crops that you valued on the day of judging will look pretty terrible the day after if you had a snow. So the big thing about what the farmers offer you as detail is things like sowing date, practices, sowing practices, direct drilling, and cultivation, fertilizer practices, whether they've done a soil test beforehand, maybe timing of fertilizer and things like that. That's all added information to highlight how they got to the point. And when you reflect back on who's done well, some of those things become more and more important as you start to give your messages to the when you present your results.
I guess what that's saying to me is, regardless of how you got there, right, it's what you see on the day.
Correct.
But I guess after judging a whole lot of winter feed competitions, what you know is to get something on the day, you're more likely to get that if you follow some of those best practices.
Absolutely. And I think, Fraser, that's where we cut to you and start to bring in some of this discussion, because, one thing is about how to win a winter feed competition. And I would say categorically, there's some funny stories that we could bring up shortly about how farmers take you to their special places, and you can see the wheel marks in the paddock. I had a farmer actually relocate a gate. It literally took us to a specific part of a paddock, and he relocated a gate, and we had to drive to the gate. The question near the bigger part of the paddock.
The big question is, did he win?
Oh no, not necessarily, but he made a big effort. But Fraser, what we'll cut to you to is actually recognise, some of these best managements from the start of actually how do you grow a decent crop? Some of the decision processes we're discussing.
Yeah, and I think the key, Al, is you don't necessarily make a decision at the start of the season to grow a feed for a winter crop for a winter feed competition. But if you have a fundamental purpose for that crop in your farming system, that's where you absolutely start. And that's if you do the basics right as though you want to get a really good crop for a good economic outcome, that sets you well on the way to achieve a good crop at the end.
And I feel that's almost the basis of the winter feed competitions in my eyes, is the highlighting and promotion of best practice. And so, diving into the best practice side, quite regularly, what I think there's a couple of different styles of cropping in New Zealand when it comes to forage cropping for animals. One is in a pasture renovation program where it's an integral part, and the other is when you're spinning a little bit faster when you've got a limited land area. And this area would be described as a runoffs and specific winter grazing blocks where you might be constrained by area. For me personally, I'd like to base the conversation off, cropping as part of a rotation to improve your pasture performance in the future.
Yeah, and I think having a long-term plan here is really important. Like, it's not just talking about the crop that's about to go in, it's about talking about what is the plan for that paddock. So whether that's a 3-year example or whether that's a 5-year, that's important. So I think if that's to go into permanent pasture that needs your lifting fertility levels, etc., you should address that through the cropping program. It's not just a crop you're putting in for 5 minutes. It's something you're doing to the paddock to correct any things that need to be corrected, to make sure that the pasture you put in at the end, whether that be a 10-year pasture, whether that be a 3-year pasture, you get the most success out of that.
Yeah, and I feel that's the thing we always deal with, isn't it? Is that typically in a pasture renovation process, your target paddock that you're coming into your cropping phase will often be your lowest performing. And there's any number of reasons for this. And some of the biggies are things like drainage, pans or a compaction over time, hard to kill broadleaf or hard to kill grass weed species, are all seeing a decline in pasture performance and this paddock drifting backwards in the ranking of the productivity of your farm. And so often that's what we're handed, isn't it? Is we're handed these paddocks, or, from a cropping perspective, the crop has to come into paddocks that require some improvement.
It does. And I think just treating the cause, not the symptoms, is really important here. So you're not just plugging a bit of seed in to get you out of a hole. You've actually got to fix what it is that got you into that hole in the first place.
First part of that is identifying it, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I guess after you've made that decision and you get your long-term plan, that's when you really start to unpack what does the process look like. Are we in an area that has really good soil structure? Everything's actually really good. We're at risk of wind. So, we're starting to think about direct drilling, utilising good seed treatments, utilising good spray outs, good crop husbandry from that point of view. We can do that. But then if we, like you outlined around compaction, is there some remedying actions we have to take? Are we having to deep rip? Are we ploughing? There's a whole host of things from a seed bed preparation, whole host of decisions that are influenced based on what we're seeing or the hole that you dig on the day before planting.
And I guess the other part of this is picking the actual crop that you're going to grow. And from a farm systems point of view, which I love coming from, is going, when do I need my feed and what are the types of animals I'm going to feed? And therefore, there are probably some crops that are more appropriate than others. So making a good crop choice is also pretty good. It'd probably change categories for you as a crop judge,
yeah.
Alistair. But I think that's again, it's an important part of that process.
But I think in the context of the discussion, we're also going to probably focus on the fact that we've got a defined crop already. I feel one of the early processes is also soil testing. I feel this is an important thing going forward from an environmental perspective. One, we want to address any problems we have from a macronutrient perspective, acknowledge any micronutrient deficiencies, but most importantly, ask for soil available nitrogen testing, because this is actually a really critical bit of information to understand, what might the nitrogen use we need on our crop to hit yield expectations. And once you also have a baseline expectation, start to do some of the maths about does your soil fertility as a total add up for enough. I mean, Marshdale would be a wonderful, our beef unit in North Canterbury would be a wonderful example of this, where, we've run cropping there for a number of years. We probably only hit very moderate crops in real terms. Often when we put nitrogen on, we often sit back and ask ourselves, have we had a good response for the amount of nitrogen we put on? And we don't put excessive amounts on by any means, but maybe we just don't see a reaction. And it's only been over time that we've realised that this property's got severe sulphur deficiency. Now, with brassicas, sulphur is not a primary element that we want to have too much of in the landscape, because some of the secondary plant compounds found in brassicas are sulphur and nitrogen components. And so having too high a sulphur is not a good thing. But being sulphur deficient, it's a macro plant nutrient, and if you don't deal with the deficiency, you will not get efficient uptake of other macronutrients, and you won't get the full expression of your plants. So understanding that background and that baggage is super important. But soil available nitrogen is something that most people should be considering going to from a cropping perspective today, because knowing the amount of nitrogen in your soil has an impact on, one, your yield parameters that you could be expecting, and two, how much you might have to put on to actually achieve the yield parameters we're talking about. So once we get the seed in the ground though, Fraser, what are some of the important things that we should be looking at in the first 6 to 10 weeks?
Could I just come back to one thing? And I think this is really critical. And I'm actually looking in your book of recipes here. Tell me, Alistair, I know you've got a very firm view on this. How important is timing?
Oh, look, timing's everything. Juddy, nice lead in. Timing's everything, because the crops, particularly brassicas, are really temperature sensitive, and if we're sowing stuff in the spring that is going to be carried forward for the winter, we are really running a very vulnerable time frame of carrying spring moisture into very late spring for the majority of the long season crops, which tend to get sown at the very end of spring early summer, which is a very vulnerable time because you're going from having moisture to being dry. And so carrying that moisture forward for a late sowing winter crop is actually quite a big deal. Now, what I'm seeing with time is people believe putting the seed in the ground earlier is going to give us higher yielding crops in the winter. But actually, all people are doing is putting crops into cooler soils, which can be slow to start. And actually, all they're doing is creating older crops by the time they get to winter.
Not bigger crops.
They are bigger crops on paper, but they're older crops.
Definitely.
So what's changing is if you sow early, you can get higher dry matter percentages later. But high dry matter percentage doesn't necessarily relate to quality. And therefore, on paper, you can get these high dry matter crops from early sowing, but half of what's grown is left behind in the paddock because animals don't want to eat wood, because the lignification of stem comes with age, comes with stress, but it also comes with age. And so the older you are, the more likely you are to be quite lignified. This would be quite a common occurrence we're seeing today, Fraser, wouldn't it? Is that people are perceiving sowing earlier as a way of getting more yield, but they don't recognise the issue of age of crop.
Yeah, and I think the last few seasons that we've had as well, we've had this, I don't know if you call it a false spring or what you call it, but we have a window in September. It's probably happened for the last 3, if not 4 seasons. And people get pretty excited about, sheesh, it's going to go dry. Let's get the drill out, get stuck in, get these brassica crops in the ground. But, if we have a cold snap, which we have for the last 3 years following this warm spell, that doesn't do any favours to your brassica crop. And what you end up doing is you end up taking a whole lot more time to get to canopy closure. You probably spend a bit more money on weed control, and your crop that you planted 6 weeks later catches up, and if not, surpasses the crop you planted right back in September.
So here's a really interesting point, and I guess I've got 2 experts here, so I'll ask the question. So I guess what you're saying there, Fraser, is that it's probably more aiming for a date rather than looking at the weather, short-term weather, and saying it's warm, I'm going to sow. Is that a fair comment?
It is, and I think prioritising your crop is important. So, and if you're thinking about Alistair talking about saving moisture, don't just chuck your kale crop in or your brassica crop in early because you're thinking you're going to run out of moisture. But feel free to spray it out early. There's no problems in the world spraying that paddock out, conserving moisture. You get another weed strike, you spray it again, and then you've done 2 things. You've had 2 really good sprays on you over that paddock, so you've reduced your weed burden significantly, and you've conserved the moisture as opposed to just trying to put your seed in a whole lot earlier in the season.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's exactly how I describe it too. Fraser, is that if you are committed to going early, what you do is you start your preparation early, and you do a great job by actually giving yourself time. In history, all of our cropping in New Zealand was done on a very long lead-in time, often 4 to 5 months fallow through winter and early spring. We were, without chemical, for example, we would have been ploughing in the day, and we'd have been doing that in late autumn, and we'd have allowed winter to break the soil down. And now microbes and other things come late autumn and early spring the following year to start mineralising, and we'd be sowing on these warmer phases on a already mineralised soil profile, which means you got all this nutrient being released at the time of thing. Now we're in such a rush. Everything has to be fast. Everything has to be instant. And what Fraser described is a perfect thing. If you feel you want to sow early, actually don't sow early, sow right. Prepare early.
Absolutely. I think just coming back to just prioritising that crop as well. I think everyone gets caught up in that I want that last cut of silage before I'm
or last grazing.
Last grazing, last cut of silage. I'm spraying the paddock out the next day. I'm turning it over and putting it into fodder bank 3 days' time. And I think if you looked at 95% of all the crop failures or challenges you have in that establishment phase, it's when corners are cut as your lead-in time. When you have a really good preparation leading up to planting, your chances of success are so much greater.
Absolutely.
So tell us a little bit about that. And so we've got our right timing. We've done some good preparation. We've probably started early in terms of prep, but we've sown on time. I kind of like that as a concept.
Yeah, and just be aware there are two primary timings for your summer cropping systems. It's the middle to the end of the second month of spring, wherever you may be. It's, once soil temperatures are hitting 12 degrees and rising consistently, you can sow at 10, but with that comes baggage. And this is the point. And that baggage could cost you more. And when you wait to sow at a 12 degree and rising soil temperature, consistently rising soil temperature, increasing day length, the reality is something that is sown at the right time will regularly overtake something that's sown earlier. And that's quite real. The second part is that for the winter cropping, so that was typically the sweet spot for summer cropping, is the middle month of spring to the end of the middle month of spring. The time for winter cropping has a lot to do with this crop is designed to be left for a very long time before utilization. And again, sowing too early is a problem because all you do is add age, which is a buildup of disease, a buildup of lignin, a number of things. That means that your decision about when you sow that winter crop in the spring and early summer defines how it may it hold or be eaten in the winter. So I still believe that the end of spring is the sweet spot for the winter crops. And in the New Zealand context, it's the end of November and the very start of the summer months. So by definition, you are seeing a time where you must carry moisture into that phase. You must have a fallow environment.
And by that, you're talking more your brassica crops.
Correct. Yeah, your bigger, longer term crops, your kales, your swedes, your fodder beets in general. Although fodder beet goes a little bit earlier because it holds for longer.
And so, Fraser, now we're at that establishment phase. What are the key? We're trying to win this winter feed competition. What are the key things we should be looking for and doing around that phase?
Yeah, so I think we've made decisions. You're right. We've sprayed out. We've got our paddock ready to drill. So I think getting your sowing rate right, having a good sowing rate there, and that will depend based on what your crop is. It'll have a bit of a your location will have a little bit. Your goals will have a little bit of a inclination as to what that ends up being, and then just getting the basics right, like. Things like treated seed. If we can give our crops the best protection right at the start, that gives them the best chance of protection, whether that's from an insect attack, whether that's from some soil-borne pathogens, any of that sort of stuff. Seed treatment's really, really helpful. It's not going to necessarily be the difference every single time, but when things happen, when insects turn up, or when you get hit with some soil pathogen that takes out your crop, they can be quite devastating. So I think an insurance policy there is useful. And then our startup fertilizer, getting our fertility right at the start, super, super important. Having that nutrients right beside the seed to give it a good kick in the guts to get it out of the ground, that's really helpful. So getting that right, getting your start right, getting your establishment right. It's all a plant numbers game. If you can get your optimum plant numbers in that first 6 to 10 weeks, that's really important. The second part is in weed control, either at drilling, post drilling, and as that crop establishes, those weeds are going to take hold of that valuable nutrients. They're going to utilise that moisture we've done a really good job of conserving, and not convert it to anything. So we want to control them as efficiently as we possibly can, so that we do end up with a crop with a good plant number and low weed population.
If I come back to the fertilizer component, it's very much about phosphate and nitrogen at the start. But for many of our brassicas, it doesn't hurt to consider boron. And the point with boron is it plays a role in the clinical sign of boron deficiency, which is brown heart in Swedes, and you can actually see it in the stems of plants too when it's particularly bad. So the thing about boron is it's quite leachable, and you can't fix the disorder by putting more boron on after you have the problem. So therefore you must get loaded at the start. So just being aware of that is quite an important one. But phosphate is for root development, and all brassicas are phosphate, respond to phosphate. And then the conversion to yield is very much nitrogen driven. And that's why knowing your soil available nitrogen as part of your total recipe never substitutes for putting phosphate and nutrient on at the start, but it does start to help define how much extra nutrient you put on afterwards. Be a fair call.
Yeah, absolutely. The next part is obviously, I've sort of talked about, you've got your fertiliser right, you've got your weed control right, but through that whole establishment phase and right up, 10, 12 weeks after establishment, if not longer, you should be walking those crops regularly. And I guess the things you're looking out for is, are there any nutrient deficiencies popping in? Because while we've tried to do our best to get it right at the start, there potentially are some things that pop up that ideally we've done a soil test, so nothing catches us by surprise. But the reality is sometimes we do get caught by surprise. So walking these paddocks regularly to catch any of these as they come. The other thing that is a bit more day to day and month to month is your insect population. So just keeping a really good eye on what insects are present, what pests are present, and we might have used seed treatment and we might have done everything right, but that's not to say that we aren't going to get an insect attack that potentially could have relatively high detrimental effects on our crop. So regular monitoring of any crop is super important.
One question I've got in terms of some of the management through that phase, and this is more around those grass crops, because I'm really interested, sometimes grass crops actually win winter feed competitions. How important is closing date on that, do you think, Alistair?
Oh, very important. I mean, that's the whole... Yeah, my criteria for judging on the day is the build-up of dead material, particularly for the amount of yield. So, for example, sometimes we see, just say the paddock's low in nutrient, you'll see yellowing, you'll see a little bit of rust or disease on autumn save pasture. So all that sort of stuff, highlights a number of things that haven't been done to the ideal level. The second one, though, is if you can actually nail your closing date and recognise you haven't just got to build up a dead material underneath, and so you're hitting that target yield without the dead material coming underneath. It highlights the ability to have a high utilisation with a good animal outcome. And remembering in the end of autumn, you've literally got another 60 to 90 days of feeding through winter to achieve. So what you've got at the end of autumn only is a snapshot of what's actually going to be viable for the whole of winter. And, it will create an unintentional bias, because, we'll know that on the day of judging, you must reflect what you see, in my opinion. But the reality is, the purpose is also important. And as I say, there'll be crops that score well, but if it snows the next day, will look completely different. Yep.
So on the day, we're in a winter feed competition. Is there anything we can do on the day, from a judging point of view that would help us?
Not about the judging point of view, but by the farmers. And there's lots of stuff they can do on the day. Yeah,
so I'm saying, what can the farmer do on the day to impress the judge?
Well, this is where it gets always interesting. There's a couple of things. They can take you to the best part of the paddock.
Right, okay, so part of the paddock.
So literally most of the competitions have a rule. We'll have rules of, you're judging, because you can't see the whole paddock often when you've got scales of farming enterprises that we get the privilege to go on to. So that, the rules will often be, there'll be like a 1 hectare or 2 hectares you're judging to try and get an idea of it. Yep. I would say one of the things that I don't like doing personally, and I know a lot of winter feed competitions in New Zealand do this, they go out and do a snapshot of yield by cutting quadrats and then doing fresh weights. And, some of the more, progressive groups will even go off and take some of that away for quality analysis and dry matters and things. But I'm very, very confident that, and I think I'd get you to comment on this next phrase, is that one of the things that we struggle with is when we measure so many crops over history, and you've measured a power load of kale over time, and we're not actually that bad at identifying, for example, kale crop yields, but the variation from just one measurement is just off the chart. And the worst thing about taking the time to take a measurement, the moment you've got a formal measurement and you put it down on a piece of paper, it must make it true. It must make this is the final measurement. And that's the one thing I prefer to do about doing it with the group of people that are walking with the crop with you going into it, depending on if it's raining or not, you might not even go too far. If it's pouring down, I had a lot of water down the back of my neck this year, unfortunately, from crops that are nearly 6 foot high. And on a rainy day, it's just not pleasant. Those poor people that are shifting those fences all winter experience that every day. But when you're just judging a winter feed crop, it's not pleasant seeing a wall of feed in front of you when it's wet. But my point being, the variation can be very high from a single measurement.
Absolutely, yeah. I think coming back to your 100ized system to score that is a lot better, because you don't necessarily have to put a yield on that crop, at prize giving as such.
Or you create the yield at the time, then you convert it to a points. But the point is, you can come to an agreement of the group of what that yield may be. So someone, typically I would venture a starting point, almost like a bidding war. And then through everyone's experience as a group, we started to get our eye in. Remember, it's about the relativity on the day.
Yep.
And so once we have our relativity right, it's the aim of the farmer judge, ourselves as judges, and the group of people around us to all just agree with what a fair and reasonable yield will be of each individual paddock.
And I think the goal of a winter feed competition judge is to determine, say, the best kale paddock, or the first, second, third kale paddock, the first, second, third fodder beet paddock. So that yield doesn't necessarily mean a lot. It's a bit of a estimate to make a good decision about what that crop is. So to go away and take that as a farmer and say, well, this is going to be what I base my feed budget off, would be not an ideal thing.
It would be very
do.
flawed and quite dangerous. And so like I say, what a farmer can do on the day is they can pick the paddock.
Mm-hmm.
Like often we only see the best, but that's not actually always the case. The reality is we have a lot of farmers who are a part of their community, and they like to enter things because they are community focused individuals. And so, they will put crops in because they're supporting the project and they're supporting the competition. And so we do get a bit of variability, and, all power to them for supporting their community and their group. But there's a fair to say that there'll be a group of people that will definitely put in their best crops. And so then the fun and games start. We start to see some quite serious some serious driving, like you see a paddock there, and it's interesting that we'll end up driving to the far end of the paddock, and then we'll go through another paddock, and then we'll come in off the fence off another part of the paddock. And so often when people are planning these trips, we're doing about 30 paddocks across a large area in a day. And some of the distances you have to travel to get to the right place within a paddock is quite interesting. Fraser, you'd have experienced a few examples of that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even the other thing I would comment about what you can do on the day is actually there's been a lot of paddocks that haven't been entered because people don't think they're quite up to scratch. Yeah. Whereas, sometimes we get those seasons where it actually is a challenging season. So actually putting in your crop potentially puts you in a pretty good chance, even if you don't think it's up to scratch. The other thing is, like you've alluded to, Al, we don't just judge on yield. So if you've got a paddock that's just followed really nice agronomic practices, sometimes there's often the judges and award crop. And, that might be from a late autumn planted brassica that's, it might only be 4 tons, so it hasn't reached its yield potential, but everything in it is quality, and it's had a really, really good place in the farm system. Often we do look at these things from not just a here and now, but why has the crop been put in, and how is it actually going to be implemented in a farm system? So while that might not win the best kale crop or the best brassica crop, so to speak, it potentially could win a Judge's Choice Award because it's a really nice example.
And I just still maintain, I still see these community competitions as still at heart a way of stimulating the competitive nature of a community, but recognise the highest principles is still to support best practice. So again, I like to value yield because that's the economics of a paddock, but I like to value quality because I believe that is the conversion of that yield, the eatable dry matter. And I value density because that's an expression of have you maintained the plant populations you were targeting from day one. I like to value weed content. Now I accept a little bit of annual weed that might come up, but where I start to crash scoring for the small component that I give to weeds weeds is when I see perennial weeds coming up, weeds that will be a problem in the next pasture renovation phase. So thistles, docks, rhizomatous grass weeds and things like this. These are things that the whole purpose of cropping is to clean these up. And so I count those down. So weeds I hit when I have tolerance to things that are short-term annual weeds that will never impact the future rotations. But I don't have any tolerance of things that are the purpose of the crop is to clean the paddock for a better future. And I think that's it. Some of them are mixes, and so some of them is the art of mixing. And the thing about the art of mixing crops like oats and grass, good example, rape and grass, another good example, is that there's no perfect recipe really. And so the reality is I feel we still judge them on the day as that a nice combination? Have they created a nice combination between the primary sowing and the understory sowing?
So in summary, I think we could kind of summarise this. I think from we've framed this up as how do you win a winter feed competition, but this is really about growing good crops and following best practice. And then we've talked a lot about the preparation, and I think the really good take-home point there was around making sure that it's the right part of the rotation and thinking not just about the crop, but what happens in that paddock years 2, 3, and 4 past that. So I think that's a really good thing to take into account. I think the type of crop and the style of crop that we're going is important, and I think Alistair, you made a great point around timing. That timing is absolutely everything. And if we want to go early, we actually start preparation early and sow on time rather than thinking that sowing early is going to be of some benefit to us. Fraser, you've covered quite nicely the things that we do during that establishment phase, making sure that we are protecting plant with seed treatment, making sure that we've got the right sowing rates and that we've done our soil tests, and then walking those crops to make sure that we're not missing anything there. So I think all of those good things, those best practice in terms of doing producing crops. And then Alistair, you've given us a really good insight into some of the little tricks that people try and pull on you in terms of what's happening on the day and making sure that I think Fraser, you've made a really good point saying that it might not be the best crop that you could grow, but given the circumstances, it might be the best crop in the district. So supporting those.
And Juddy, I'll just summarise and finish is that the topic's definitely the real part of the topic is setting up to do best practice to grow great crops that mean that the cost that you invest is rewarded by edible yield at the end by getting all things right. Step out of that, and the fun part and the community part is that crop competitions and community-based crop competitions are a wonderful way of sharing techniques, sharing best practices. And that's, again, what I would continue to value is that once community groups enter this scenario of stimulating a little bit of local competition to highlight what best practices can achieve, I feel that's the greatest and healthiest part of how to win a feed competition.
Excellent. Well, listen, I've got to get to the garage. I've dropped my electric motorbike off there and it seems it's run out of electrons. So I better go and pick that up. See you next time.